We're back in our lesson on the study and evaluation of internal control. So in the previous lesson, we talked about internal controls and its basic components. So in this lesson, we will going to discuss the assessment of the internal control and what would be the auditor's response to the assessment. So what will the auditor do in response to the preliminary assessment and also on the updated assessment of the internal controls. So the first one, we have first topic here would be the internal control evaluation in the FS audit. So in order to perform this evaluation, so we need to perform several steps. So the first one is to obtain an understanding of the client's internal control. So this step involves the following. First is to perform a preliminary review. The second one is to identify the transaction cycles. Third is document the system. Then perform a transaction walkthrough and identify the controls that are potentially reliable. So still under step one, again, the first step under step one is performing a preliminary review. So in here, the auditor uses sources such as past experience with the client and an understanding of the industry in which the client operates to determine the risk of material misstatement. So coming from this information that the auditor gathers, he will set now set a preliminary assessment or preliminary review of the entity's internal control. So understanding of the components of the internal controls relevant to the audit provides the auditor with a general knowledge of the entity's organizational structure, of the methods used to communicate responsibility and authority, and the methods used by management to supervise the system. Also, this will provide the auditor the general knowledge of the various classes of transactions and the methods by which each significant class of transactions are authorized, executed, initially recorded, and subsequently processed. So if you're able to know or have an idea of how the components of the internal control interrelate with each other in the client's business, so you will be able to have a picture of how it will look like, and most likely you can arrive at an assessment of how strong or how weak their internal control is. Second one is you identify the transaction cycles. So as we already know in our accounting information system course, transaction cycles are transactions in business which are interconnected to each other and are classified into convenient groupings. So the most common transaction cycles identified are, we have first the revenue cycle. So it is also combined with the revenue, receivables, or the cash receipt cycle. So they are interrelated because the revenue cycle is also connected to the collection of the receivables and also to the collection of cash if it is a cash sale. Also, we have the purchasing or payables or the disbursement cycle. This relates to the payments of cash for purchases or for other forms of expenses. Then we have the payroll cycle. So this involves the payment for the labor and also for the salary of our employees. And then we have the production or conversion cycle, that's on the manufacturing process. And then we also have the financing and investing cycle, which relates to the investments and sources of borrowings. So what would be the advantage of being able to identify the transaction cycles. So it will enable the auditor to gain an adequate understanding of the flow of transactions from inception to conclusion, and to make sure all significant processes are identified and noted, and each phase of the transaction flow is evaluated. So the auditor will know asa magsugod o trace up or vouch. So it could be, you can start from the FS and then end to the documents, supporting documents, or you can also start from the supporting documents and end in the financial statements. But you cannot do so if you don't have a picture of how the information looks like in the entity. Second, it will enable the auditor to better evaluate the impact of internal control on specific financial statement items affected, to assist him in determining the nature, timing, and extent of the substantive test. So, being able to identify the transaction cycle, the auditor will know what would be the extent of the effect of the internal controls on the specific amounts that are found in the financial statements, because the strength or the weakness of a certain internal control could have a influence on the amounts that are being recorded in terms of the accuracy or the correctness or the valuation or the completeness or the existence of the assertions in the financial statements. So the third step under step 1 would be documentation of the understanding of the internal control. So documentation is a means of ensuring that auditors comply with the significant requirements of the GAAS, or the generally accepted auditing standards. So when is documentation required? So first, in the discussion among the engagement team regarding the susceptibility of the entity's FS to material misstatement and the significant decision reached. It should also be carried out in the understanding obtained regarding each of the aspects of the entity and its environment and each of the 5 internal control components. Also, identified and assessed risks of material misstatements at the FS level and at the assertion level, and documenting as well the risks identified and related controls evaluated as a result of significant risks and risks for which it is not possible to reduce risk of material misstatement. So what are the methods of documentation? So we can use narratives. That's a written description of a particular phase of an accounting system. So that's put in words or in paragraphs. Then we have internal control questionnaires. It consists of series of questions designed to identify control points and techniques and detect control deficiencies. So it's like a question and answer document wherein there are several questions, and the personnel assigned to answer would either say yes or no, or could provide a brief explanation. So it's a questionnaire. And you can also use flowcharts. This constitute interrelated symbols which diagram the flow of transactions and events throughout the system. The fourth step under step 1 is performing a transaction walkthrough. So what is a walkthrough? So walkthroughs are cradle to grave reviews of transaction cycles. So you start at the beginning of a transaction cycle, usually a source document, and walk the transaction to the end, usually posting to the general ledger. So it could also start in reverse. So it could also start in the termination of the transaction. So it could start at the FS and then it will go back to the inception. So the start, it will go back to the supporting documents. So the purpose for the walkthroughs is to verify narrative, questionnaire, or the flowchart documentation, and to familiarize the author with the audit trail. And then lastly, identify the controls that are potentially reliable. So it is important to be able to identify the reliable controls because the rule is that the auditor will only test the controls that he um, deems reliable or he will rely upon. Because if the um, internal controls are not reliable, so the auditor will no longer test them, but he will proceed to the substantive testing. Then we proceed with step 2. So in step 2, we make preliminary assessment of the control risk. So after we have the background and a picture or the overview of the internal controls of the entity, now we can make a preliminary assessment. So preliminary because this is your your initial assessment. So uh, this is not really the final assessment, but this is just for your starting point. So this will be your initial assessment of the control risk. So the combined assessments of control risk and inherent risk shall be the basis for determining the nature, timing, and extent of the substantive tests. So in assessing the control risk, the auditor considers the errors and irregularities that could occur and that could result in material misstatements in the FS. So since the auditor already has an idea of how the information system of the company based on the transaction cycles will look like and what are the processes of the entity with regards to the processing of the information, the auditor can now have an idea what would be the possible errors or irregularities that may arise because of the design of the internal controls of the entity. And then the auditor will also identify the relevant control procedures designed to prevent any errors or irregularities. So if the auditor thinks that there's a possibility that there are errors or irregularities, there should also be controls that are in place to prevent those errors. So that is how the auditor can assess if the controls of the entity are strong or are they weak. And perform tests of controls on the control procedures to be relied on in designing substantive tests. So as I have mentioned earlier, the auditor will only test those controls that are reliable. If they're not reliable based on his assessment, he will not waste time in testing those controls but will proceed to a more extensive substantive testing. So what if there is a high control risk assessment and there is also a less than high control risk assessment? So when we say high control risk assessment, it means na um, based on our preliminary assessment, based on the information that we have gathered, background of the company, the possibility of the errors and the irregularities, we came up to an assessment that there is a high risk that the internal controls cannot detect or cannot prevent or cannot correct the misstatements. So we can assess it as high. We can also assess it as less than high if we, um, in our opinion or in our assessment, we can say that the internal controls of the company has the capability to prevent, detect, and correct the irregularities or errors if there are any existing misstatements. So if there is a high control risk assessment, there is a likelihood that significant misstatements exist in the FS because internal controls are inadequate. So dili siya enough. Again, dili siya enough in order to prevent, detect, or correct misstatements. And internal controls cannot be relied upon. So dili siya kasaligan. So this high control risk assessment also results from the auditor's belief that control structure, policies, and procedures have not been effectively designed or have not operated effectively. So duha magud ka factors ang pwedeng maka-affect sa ato ang internal controls. It could be the design or it could be the implementation or ang iyang pag-operate. So dili enough nga nindot ang iyang design sa imong internal controls pero dili gihapon na implement og tarong or ineffective siya in its operations. Pwede pud nga dili pud nindot ang design but operating effectively. So nindot gyud nang duha, nindot ang pagka-design og maayo pud ang they are actually in place and are working. We could also assess it as less than high control risk. So if we do so, if we think that the internal controls are like strong or they are effective, so what should the auditor do? So in order to assess control risk at below maximum level, the auditor must be able to identify the specific control structures and policies and procedures that are in place and are likely to prevent and detect material misstatements. Then test whether those policies and procedures are designed and operating effectively. So you need to perform the test of controls. Then we have step 3 is to determine the appropriate response to the assessed risk. So after you have come up with your preliminary assessment of the control risk, so if you can identify it as high or as low risk, so you need to respond to the risk. So it's not enough that you have the assessment but you do not do anything about it. There should be an action on the part of the auditor. So the auditor should determine the overall responses to the assessed risks at the FS level and should design and perform further audit procedures such as tests of controls and substantive tests to respond to assessed risk at the assertion level. So there should be a overall response at the FS level and a design of the further audit procedures at the assertion level. So what would be the overall responses that the auditor may consider? So it could be emphasizing to the audit team the need to maintain professional skepticism in gathering and evaluating audit evidence. So they must be alert to any circumstances, especially those that will directly affect the evaluation of the company's financial statement as to the reliability. And of course, if they meet the assertions on existence, completeness, presentation and disclosure, and proper evaluation. Okay, assigning more experienced staff or those with special skills, or they can use experts. Then provide more supervision. Incorporate additional element of unpredictability in the selection of audit procedures to be performed. Making general changes to the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedures. So how is this done? So if we say nature of audit procedures, so you have to decide, are you going to perform test of controls? So again, test of controls is performed if you rely on the controls. And for the substantive test, so how extensive and what type of test are you going to perform? Then, of course, you have the timing of the audit procedures. So, do you perform it at interim? Is it at less than a year? Or is it at period end at the end of the year? And then you have the extent of the audit procedures. Are they extensive or less extensive? Or do you use a large sample size or do you use a smaller sample size? So now what will be the auditor's response? So here is a table that summarizes the approach of the auditor on the assessed level of the preliminary assessment of control risk. So the first one here is we have the high assessment. So of course, if you assess it, the controls, you assess the control risk as high, of course, you do not intend to rely. That's why it's no reliance. You don't intend to rely on the controls. So in order to balance or compensate, because we know that there should be an overall acceptable audit risk. So this acceptable audit risk is a combination of your inherent risk, and then you have the control risk, and we have your detection risk. So if remember that the inherent risk is on the nature of the accounts, if they are susceptible to uh, misstatements, and control risk relates to the strength of the controls or the weakness of the controls. So is the controls effective in preventing, detecting, and correcting misstatements if they really exist? Because dili yun nato malikayan nga naagi mga misstatements nga pwedeng mag-appear or naagi pwedeng misstatements sa ato ang financial statements or sa ato ang records, but kaya ba na siya nga makita or ma-prevent sa ato ang controls? So kung inherent risk niya daan is high, so kinahanglan nga ang ato ang controls would be strong enough para ma-prevent gihapon ang any possible nga misstatements. So since we want to maintain a certain audit risk, di ba ang audit risk is ang risk nga we will arrive in a wrong opinion because we perceive the financial statements to be clean or free from misstatements. So kung kani sila, puro ni sila mga high, if these are high, so this one, in order to maintain this audit risk, we need to ensure that this would be lower. Diba? Kung taas ni sila, kung taas magani ni, kinahanglan kani would be lower para ma-maintain nato ang acceptable audit risk. Okay? So therefore, if we already perceive this one as high, so kung high ang ato ang control risk, so what the auditor should do in response, di ba? This is the function of the auditor. So unsa may dapat buhaton sa auditor in response to this high control risk, ang auditor should be more alert and should perform more extensive tests. Diba? Kay kabalo na gud siya nga taas ang risk sa ato ang controls. Dili siya kasaligan, diba? Kay no reliance man. Kung dili siya kasaligan, mag-relax bang auditor? Dili. So mag-perform siya og extensive test. And this will result to a lower detection risk. Ano lower man ang detection risk? So if we perform extensive tests, what happens now is that there's a lesser chance nga dili kasakop si auditor sa mga misstatements. Ngano lesser man ang chance, mao man siya ang chance nga di siya kasakop, di ba? So ma-lesser ang chance nga di siya kasakop kay maayo man ang pagka-perform sa test. So that's why there's a decrease in the acceptable audit risk. Okay? So next would be, is the auditor going to perform the test of controls? I have mentioned earlier, no more. So the auditor will not perform a test of controls on controls nga wala niya saligi, because that would be a waste of time. Testing controls nga dili day kasaligan. For what? Kano i-test mo man nimo, diba? You only test the controls that are reliable to ensure that they really do their function. Nga tinuod gyud nga kaya nilang maka-prevent, detect, and correct misstatements. Are you going to perform substantive tests? Yes, of course. Next, what if your assessment of the control risk is low? So what if low ang imuhang assessment? So what will happen now? So therefore, the approach of the auditor is reliance. Pag ubos imuhang control risk, so low ra siya. So meaning, you intend to rely upon the controls. Tanaw nimo, low ra ang risk nga dili niya prevent, detect, or makorek ang errors. So, para nimo okay ang controls. Strong ang controls. And what happens to your acceptable detection risk? So, to maintain this acceptable audit risk, your detection risk would be high para mabalance. Diba? So, mabalance siya, ma-maintain gihapon ni audit risk. Kaya kung imo hapon ni siyang i-low, so ubos po ni mo hang audit risk. Okay? So, naman tayo overall audit risk nga acceptable na to. Para na to okay ra ni siya nga level. So, para mag-balance siya, so musaka imong detection risk, which is logical nga musaka ang detection risk. Nganong logical man siya? Kaya di ba pag ang control risk assessment nato is low, the auditor relies on the controls. And pag, di ba, pag taas taog pagsalig, na ano no possibility nga, dili na nato ma-detect ang mga misstatements tungod ana nga pagsalig. Di ba? Tanaw na to nga, okay naman ang mga controls. So, ang financial statement pod, wala pod kayo siya error. So, kung ang imuhang pagtanaw is wala kayo error ang financial statements, are you going to be extensive in your test? No, you would be less extensive. Saligod ka. Diba? So, less extensive ang imuhang mga testing. Dili kaayo siya grabe. Asa man nga extensive ang testing? In terms of the substantive test, kay asa man ka mo bat-bat og test ani. Ani ka sa test of controls. I-test yun nimo ang mga internal controls. Kung tinuod ba yun nga kasaligan ni siya. Okay? So, less extensive in the sense nga, dili na tong mga substantive test kaayo ang imong focus. Ang focus nimo kaayo here is the test of controls. You're going to prove or disprove the controls by performing the test of controls. Are you going to perform a substantive test? Yes, gihapon. In either of the assessment, you will still perform the substantive testing. Dili pwede nga wala. Naagihapon siya. Ang mahimong kalahian is the extent of your substantive testing. Since na ani man ka na focus sa test of control, so ma-minimize kayo ni siya. Pero kung wala kayo na perform na test of control, of course, ani gyud ka mag-focus. So, maog yun nimo hang ayo-ayohon kaning substantive testing. Now, we proceed to the test of controls. So, what is test of controls? So, it tests either the effectiveness of the design or operation of the client's internal control or the procedure in support of a less than high control risk assessment. So, i-perform nimo siya in order to determine if the design and operation of the internal control kay effective. So, strong ba siya or dili? And also, since you have assessed that the internal controls are reliable or your control risk is low, so you have to support that by performing this test of controls. So remember, tests of controls are applied only to those controls on which the auditor intends to rely when designing substantive tests of account balance. So katura pong mga saligan niya. Pero katong mga controls nga wala niya saligi, dili na siya mag-test of controls adto. Okay? So only those specific controls nga iyahang kasaligan. So what would be the test of controls procedures that can be done? So it could be inquiry of the client personnel. However, you must remember that inquiry alone is not enough to get evidence, okay? Or to provide sufficient evidence to support a conclusion about whether the specific control activity is effective. Remember, you're just asking, okay? You cannot get a very solid nga evidence. That's why in the court, di ba, pag maghatag og testimony, kinahanglan na paglaing supporting evidences. Dili lang enough nga you are able to get a response. Kinahanglan pagyud og other supporting evidence. You can also perform observation of application of policies and procedures. So you have to observe if the controls are being applied. Not only asking them, perform ba din ninyo ma'am? Of course, naturally, some would say yes, perform na mo, even if they do not actually perform that. But you can actually observe them. You see their operations. You view their operations. You go to the area if they are really following the policies and procedures. So tests based on observation, inquiry, and examination of documents and records often provide sufficient evidence about the operating effectiveness of a control. So the inquiry, in combination with other procedures, this can provide an evidence. You can also perform inspection, but you have to remember that the auditor does not examine all of the transactions and detailed records related to the controls tested, but only obtains a sample, so only a portion of the population. And you can also perform re-performance or recalculation. So the auditor may have to re-perform the application of a control to obtain adequate evidence that it is operating effectively. Okay, so in these procedures, you're going to test only if the internal controls are really in place and these are really effective. It does not automatically mean that the records are really accurate, but you are trying to know if gi-apply ba gyud naa ang controls unya kaya ba niyang maka-detect og mga errors naa ba siya in place or kaya ba niyang maka-prevent kung pananglitan mahitabo ang mga misstatements and kaya ba niyang makorek on a timely basis. Okay? Because kung wala na siya, kung absent na siya nga mga functions sa internal control, kung dili kaya na buhaton sa internal control, naagyod akong possibility that the records itself could contain misstatements. Kaya di gud niya ma-prevent, dili niya ma-detect, di pa niya ma-correct, so naagyoy likelihood nga na ay misstatements. That's why we need to test the controls. Again, if they are reliable. Diba? Or if the auditor thinks that they are reliable. Again, if dili siya reliable para sa auditor, no need to test. Diba? You can now directly conclude, not yet conclude, but you can now directly say nga, di man siya kasaligan, di siya ka-prevent, di siya ka-detect, di po siya ka-correct. So, naagyoy sayop sa mga amounts. That's why you need to perform substantive testing. So, upon your testing of the controls, you can discover control deviations, or these are also called as audit exceptions. So, audit exceptions are merely discrepancies or deviations from the anticipated result of testing one or more of the service organization's control activities. So, pag moingon tag mo deviate, diba? Pag mo deviate na siya, nagpalahi. So, wala siya mo tunong or wala siya mo ayon sa kung unsa man dapat ang mga control activities. So each control within the service organization's description of the audit must undergo testing by the auditor. He or she must verify and validate that the given manager's description is accurate and the controls have been suitably designed and are operating effectively to achieve all related control objectives or criteria. Kaya di ba kabalo naman ka kung unsa man ang ilahang policies and procedures, you need to check if na tunong ba gyud ang actual nga operations or actual gyud nga performance sa entity. Essentially, an audit exception is any finding that falls outside of the expected results of an audit after going through the necessary steps. But you have to remember, it does not mean that an error had been made in the accounting records because there are some deviations that cannot be directly linked to an error in the records. Pwede ra siya nga wala na siya motunong sa ilahang protocol, like for example, na-skip ang authorization, walay signature, pero it doesn't mean nga wrong na ang amounts. kay wala man siya mo relate sa amounts or sa figures. So for example, all requisitions should bear the signature of the department head. And what if pag-check nimo sa mga documents is na ay certain nga requisition nga wala pirmahan. This does not automatically mean that since wala siya pirma, automatic wrong na ang amount. Dili man. It's only a deviation, a departure lang from what should have been done. Okay? But it could provide you an indicator nga there may be times nga ma-overlook yun ang mga protocols or ang mga procedures. And that's why you need to be alert of that. Because if it happens frequently or it happens also in in the other transactions, there might be a chance nga malink po siya sa mga errors in the amounts. Next is the timing of the test of controls. So when does the auditor performs the test of controls? So it is dependent on the auditor's objective, and he's the one who determines the period of reliance on those controls. So if the auditor tests controls at a particular time, the auditor only obtains audit evidence that the controls operated effectively at that time. However, if the auditor tests controls throughout a period of time, he obtains audit evidence of the effectiveness of the operation of the controls during that period. So the auditor can perform this test controls. It could be at interim or less than a year, or he could perform it at year end. So another important timing matter is how much to rely on tests of prior periods as evidence that controls are effectively designed and continue to operate effectively during the current audit period. So now what would be the effect on the test of controls if there is a reliance on the operating effectives of the internal control, or the degree of reliance? And also, what will happen to the test of controls based on the rate of expected deviation from the control? So how do we know? So first is on the reliance. So the more we rely, or as we increase our reliance, or the greater our reliance on the operating effectiveness of the internal control, the greater would be or the more extensive would be our test of controls, because we want to figure out if the controls really are effective. Next is if it is lesser reliance, of course, the extent of the tests of controls would be lesser. Okay, so however, we have to be alert, because as we decrease our reliance, and then what if wala na gyud ta salig sa test of control, we no longer perform a test of controls. Okay, so once nga wala na tayo reliance, or very high control risk ta, or high atong control risk, then we will no longer perform the test of controls. Next is on the rate of expected deviation. So, di ba, unsa man kaha ang rate nga ni deviate siya or ni depart siya sa dapat unta nga protocol sa company, or dapat nga control sa company. So, again, as a rule, if nag-alam kadako ang deviation, so dapat ang atong test of controls would be more extensive. Okay? And opposite, of course, if it is lesser, then dili kaayo nga na ang ka-extensive. However, the auditor would consider whether the rate of expected deviation indicates that the control will not be sufficient to reduce the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level to that assessed by the auditor. Kay kung grabe na jud ka taas ang expected deviation, then we can say it's no longer that reliable. And di ba, as a rule, if dili na ta mo rely sa controls, then we should cease performing the test of controls. So if the rate of the expected deviation is expected to be too high, so kung grabe na sad kaayo ka, taas nga mo kada test na lang nato kay magsige na lang siya saka niya. Ang atong expectation is mas daghan pa gyud ang mga deviation. So the auditor may determine the test of controls for a particular assertion may not be effective. And as a result, kung dili effective ang controls for that assertion, what do? We do not rely on the controls and we will stop our test of controls. So the auditor designs tests of controls to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence that the controls operated effectively throughout the period of reliance. Okay? Now, step 4 is to reassess the level of control risk. So, if you can recall, previously, we have the preliminary assessment. So, now, we will perform another assessment of control risk. So, the auditor should evaluate whether the internal controls are designed and operating as contemplated in the preliminary assessment of control risk. So here, what will be the results of evaluation and what the auditor should do? So first is, if the risk of material misstatement for particular audit objectives is higher than originally expected, so after sa imong preliminary assessment o yan nag-test of controls ka, tanaw nimo ang risk sa material misstatement murag mas dako-dako man siguro kaysa sa katong una na akong expectation. So what the auditor should do is to reassess the level of the control risk and reconsider the assurance needed from substantive testing. So pwede nimong i-more extensive imuhang substantive test. If also you evaluate that the test of controls reveal a departure from or breakdown in the prescribed controls, then you consider the specific cause and document the conclusions reached. Now that you have performed the reassessment, so what should the auditor do in response to those, to the reassessed nga control risk? So now, if your initial assessment or preliminary assessment is low, and now after the reassessment, you still think that the control risk is still low or less than high or below maximum, then again, your approach would be reliance. So, yung salig ka. So, tanaw nimo okay ang ilang internal controls. So, what would be the effect on the substantive test? Remember that substantive test comes after the test of controls if there is a test of control being done. So, but regardless of the assessment, there is still a substantive test. Okay? So, you have to remember nga whether your control risk is high or low, naagyod gihapon ang substantive testing. Ang pwedeng mawala kay katurang test of controls. Mawa ang test of controls kung ang control risk is high. Okay? So now, if your control risk is less than high lang gihapon, so your substantive testing would be less effective. So ano less effective man siya? Kay ang more extensive procedures would be on the test of controls. And then when do you perform your substantive testing? That's at interim. Okay, this is your timing. And what would be the extent of your substantive testing? That would be smaller sample size. Now, what if your control risk is now changed to high? So, what if low siya pag preliminary, but then pag tanaw nimo after you have evaluated the entity, you now assess that it should be high. So, you can now switch to no reliance. Remember, pag high ang imong control risk, you will proceed to a more effective substantive testing. Okay? So, ani na gyud ka mag-focus sa imong substantive test, ani ka mag-intensify. And your test will now be moved to nearer or at the year end. That is in terms of your timing. And you will have larger sample sizes. Okay, so mas daghan kag i-cover nga evidence. So, as a recap, di ba, if your control risk is low, so you will proceed to test of controls, diba, initially. So what will now happen to your substantive testing? So your substantive testing will be less extensive. Okay? So lesser siya. If your control risk is high, what will happen to your substantive test? It would be more extensive. So pasa ka. So, opposite silang direction, di ba? Pag taas kag control risk, dapat not opposite ay, parehas. So, parehas sila og direction. So, kung taas ang control risk, dapat ayu-ayuhon gyud nako og pangitag evidence. Pero pag ubos ang control risk, dili kayo extensive ako ang substantive test. Substantive testing. Adto ko mag ayu-ayu sa test of controls. I have to make sure that the controls are really effective to support my assessment of a low control risk or less than high control risk. Next, what would be the documentation requirements? Okay, so if your assessment of the risk is high, so you need to document the understanding of the internal control and the control risk assessment. If your risk assessment is less than high, you need to document understanding of the internal control, the control risk assessment, and the basis for the control risk assessment. Now we have the timing, nature, and extent of the substantive test. So now, after we have already evaluated our internal controls, made the preliminary, and we made the another assessment, we have the reassessment of the internal controls. Now we can plan now for the substantive tests. So remember, ang substantive test is more particular on the amounts. Okay, nga naa sa ato ang financial statements. So, katunag yung mga assertions na directly makita sa ato ang FS. Okay, so what happens to the evidence that we will get from the substantive test in response to the control risk assessment? So, if our control risk assessment is high, so meaning dili reliable sa atong pantanaw ang internal controls, so what will happen to the evidence from the substantive test? So it should also be higher, di ba? Or more extensive, or mas dapat taas og or mas daghan og evidence. Okay, di ba? If you can recall in the previous slide, di ba? If the control risk is high, dapat atong substantive testing would be high, or it should also be extensive. So extensive, there would be more evidence, di ba? If you can recall, this would be a larger sample size. And opposite, if your control risk assessment is less than high, so dili kayo taas, so of course your evidence would be lesser. So substantive testing would be lesser, so less extensive, and you have lesser evidence. Evidence in terms of substantive test, and you have a smaller sample size. Okay, now we have the deficiency in internal control. So it happens, or it exists, when a control is designed, implemented, or operated in such a way that it is unable to prevent or detect and correct misstatements in the financial statements on a timely basis. So a control necessary to prevent or detect and correct misstatements in the financial statements on a timely basis is also missing. So we can say that the internal control is deficient kung una, dili niya kayang i-prevent or i-detect or i-correct ang mga misstatements nga nahitabo na sa financial statements, or ang control mismo is wala. It is missing. So a significant deficiency in internal control is a deficiency or combination of deficiencies in internal control that, in the auditor's professional judgment, is of sufficient importance to merit the attention of those charged with governance. So the auditor should determine whether, on the basis of the audit work performed, the auditor has identified one or more deficiencies in internal control. So what should the auditor do? So the auditor shall communicate to management at an appropriate level of responsibility on a timely basis in writing the significant deficiencies in the internal control and other types of deficiencies in the internal control identified during the audit that have not been communicated to management by other parties, and that the auditor's professional judgment are of sufficient importance to merit management's attention. Okay, so that is the last part of our lesson. So I hope you have learned something about internal controls. So you can also reread the material for your review, and I hope that you have obtained a um, significant nga information, especially on the internal control. So it is very, very important that the auditor is able to evaluate properly the internal control, because that is one of the important starting points on how you're going to perform the substantive testing. Okay, so that's the end of our lesson for today. See you on our next class.